The morning sun bathed the Vatican gardens, casting a golden hue over the statues and stained glass windows of St. Peter's Basilica. It was a day like any other, or at least it should have been. Pope Francis, as usual, had woken up early. After a brief walk through the gardens, he headed to his private chapel for a moment of prayer and reflection. The peace of the place was almost palpable, interrupted only by the singing of birds and the soft whisper of the wind. As he prayed, the Pope reflected on the challenges of the modern world: poverty, inequality, the lack of dialogue among nations. He knew his role extended beyond the walls of the Vatican. He was a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope in dark times. But that day, something was about to test not only his faith, but also his ability to lead with humility and courage. The chapel door opened softly. A cardinal, pale-faced and with trembling hands, entered and bowed. "Your Holiness, there is a police officer here. He has an arrest warrant." The Pope looked up, surprised but not alarmed. He closed the small prayer book he was holding and stood up slowly as if he needed a moment to process those words. "An arrest warrant? For me?" The cardinal nodded, avoiding the Pope's gaze. "He insists on speaking directly with you. He says it's a matter of extreme urgency." Pope Francis took a deep breath, adjusted his glasses, and took a step toward the door. "Then let us receive him. No one should be ignored, especially those who are doing their duty." The corridor leading to the audience hall seemed longer than usual. The Pope's footsteps echoed off the marble walls as the cardinal followed in silence. When they reached the hall, a uniformed man stood waiting, holding a folder in his hand. He was tall, with piercing eyes and an expression that mixed determination and uncertainty. "I am Marco Rossi, an Interpol officer," said the policeman, presenting his identification. "I have here an arrest warrant for you, Your Holiness." The Pope looked at the document Marco was holding out, but did not take it. Instead, he gazed at the officer with a serene, almost paternal look. "And what is the charge, my son?" Marco hesitated for a moment, as if he wasn't prepared for the Pope's calmness. "Money laundering and involvement with an international criminal organization. The evidence is compelling." The silence that followed was cutting. The cardinal, standing beside the Pope, seemed about to faint. But Pope Francis simply smiled faintly, as if this were just another test to overcome. "I see. And what do you suggest we do now, Officer Rossi?" Marco frowned, confused by the Pope's reaction. He had expected resistance, perhaps even indignation, but not this almost disconcerting calm. I need to take you into custody, Your Holiness. It's the law." The Pope nodded, as if agreeing with the officer's logic. "Then let us follow the law. But first, I would like to hear your story. Perhaps we can learn something from each other." Marco stood still, unsure how to react. He was used to dealing with criminals, not with a man who seemed willing to listen to him as if they were old friends. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican, the news was already spreading. Cameras and reporters crowded the gates, eager for any information. The world was about to witness one of the most surprising days in recent history. The audience hall, normally a place for diplomatic meetings and peaceful conversations, was now charged with an almost palpable tension. Marco Rossi, the Interpol officer, still held the folder with the arrest warrant, but his rigid posture was beginning to waver in the face of Pope Francis's serenity. "Please sit," said the Pope, indicating a chair beside the table. "You've come from far away. You must be tired." Marco hesitated, but eventually accepted the invitation. He placed the folder on the table and opened it, pulling out a dossier with documents and photographs. "Here is the evidence," he said, handing the papers to the Pope. "It indicates that you were involved in irregular financial transactions with a criminal organization. Millions of euros were diverted from donations made to the Vatican and redirected to offshore accounts. The Pope flipped through the documents calmly, examining the pages carefully. The photographs showed bank statements, signatures, and even images of meetings in suspicious locations. To someone who didn't know the Pope, the evidence seemed convincing, but Francis knew something was wrong. "These signatures," murmured the Pope, pointing to one of the pages. "They are not mine, and these meetings shown here, they never happened." Marco frowned, clearly surprised by the statement. "With all due respect, Your Holiness, the investigations were conducted rigorously. There are witnesses, documents, even recordings that corroborate this information." The Pope sighed, placing the papers back on the table. "My son, I do not doubt your work, but I believe someone may be using my name to cover up their own actions. The Vatican is a large and complex institution, and we do not always have control over everything that happens in its name." Marco looked at the Pope, trying to decipher whether these words were an attempt at defense or an admission of guilt. He was used to dealing with criminals who lied without hesitation, but something in the Pope's sincerity made him question his own convictions. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican, the situation was becoming more complicated. The news of the arrest warrant had spread like wildfire. Reporters from around the world crowded the gates, while helicopters hovered overhead, capturing aerial images of St. Peter's Basilica. On social media, hashtags like "Pope arrested" and "Vatican in crisis" began trending, and opinions were divided between those who believed in the Pope's innocence and those demanding justice. Inside the Vatican, the cardinals gathered in an adjacent room, arguing loudly about how to handle the situation. "This is absurd. How can anyone believe the Pope would be involved in something like this?" exclaimed one of the cardinals, slamming his fist on the table. "We need to act quickly," said another. "If we don't do something, the Vatican's reputation will be ruined." The cardinal, who had accompanied the Pope to the audience hall, entered. The meeting, his face still pale. "The Pope is speaking with the officer. He seems calm, but I don't know how long that will last." As the cardinals debated, Pope Francis continued his dialogue with Marco. "Do you have a family, Marco?" asked the Pope, abruptly changing the course of the conversation. Marco hesitated, surprised by the question. "Yes, Your Holiness, I have a daughter. She's 8 years old." The Pope smiled, as if that information were the most important thing in the world. "She must be the light of your life. Do you see her often?" Marco looked down, his hardened expression giving way to a shadow of sadness. "Not as often as I'd like. My job, it takes up a lot of my time." The Pope nodded as if he understood perfectly. "Work is important, but family is sacred. Never forget that." Marco looked at the Pope, confused. He had come to arrest a man accused of serious crimes, but now he found himself engaged in a conversation about family and values. Something about this interaction made him question not only the accusation, but also his own priorities. Meanwhile, the tension outside the Vatican continued to grow. The crowd at the gates grew larger by the minute, and local authorities began to worry about the possibility of conflict. The entire world was watching the Vatican, and no one knew how this story would end. The audience hall, now illuminated by the soft light of late morning, seemed like a world apart from the chaos unfolding outside. Pope Francis and Marco Rossi remained seated at the table, but the dynamic between them had shifted. The officer, initially rigid and determined, now seemed more reflective, as if battling an internal storm. "You said your daughter is 8 years old," continued the Pope, maintaining his calm and welcoming tone. "Does she like school? What does she dream of becoming when she grows up?" Marco smiled faintly, for the first time since entering the Vatican. "She loves to draw. She says she wants to be an artist, but I don't know if that's a stable career, you know." The Pope tilted his head, as if deeply considering Marco's words. "The world needs artists, my son. They help us see beauty even in the darkest moments. Perhaps your daughter is teaching us an important lesson." Marco looked at the Pope, surprised by the perspective. He had never thought of art in that way. For him, life had always been about rules, duties, and responsibilities. But here, in this room, he began to wonder if he might be missing something important. "And you, Your Holiness?" asked Marco, almost without thinking. "What did you dream of becoming when you were a child?" The Pope chuckled softly, a sound that echoed through the room like a comforting melody. "I wanted to be a butcher, like my father. But life had other plans for me, and look where I am now." Marco couldn't help but smile wider. It was strange to think of the Pope as an ordinary child, with simple dreams and a life that could have been completely different. "But I don't regret it," continued the Pope. "Every step I took brought me here, and every person I met taught me something valuable, including you, Marco." The officer frowned, confused. "Me? What could I possibly teach you?" The Pope looked at him with a penetrating but gentle gaze. "You showed me that even those who enforce the law with rigor have hearts that can be touched, and that sometimes justice needs to be tempered with compassion." Marco looked down, feeling a weight he couldn't explain. He had spent years chasing criminals, believing the world was divided between good and evil. But here, in front of the Pope, he began to realize that things weren't always so simple. Meanwhile, outside, the situation continued to escalate. The crowd at the Vatican gates now included not only reporters, but also faithful and curious onlookers, all eager for news. Social media buzzed with theories and speculation, and the pressure on authorities to resolve the situation grew by the minute. Inside the Vatican, the cardinals were still arguing, but now with a tone of desperation. "We need to do something," exclaimed one of them. "We can't let this continue." "But what can we do?" replied another. "If we interfere, we might make things worse." The cardinal who had accompanied the Pope to the audience hall entered again, this time with a calmer expression. "The Pope is speaking with the officer. He seems calm, but I don't know how long that will last." As the cardinals reflected on these words, Pope Francis continued his dialogue with Marco. "Have you ever stopped to think about why you chose to be a police officer?" asked the Pope. Marco hesitated, as if he had never considered the question. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to protect people, to make sure the world was a safer place." The Pope nodded, as if that were exactly the answer he had expected to hear. "And do you still believe in that? That you're making a difference?" Marco looked at the Pope, and for the first time his expression showed a crack in the armor of professionalism he always wore. "I don't know anymore, Your Holiness. Sometimes I feel like I'm just following orders, without questioning whether they're right or wrong." The Pope placed his hand on Marco's, a gesture of support that surprised the officer. "Questioning is not a sign of weakness, my son. It's a sign of wisdom, and perhaps it's time for you to start asking the right questions." Marco felt a lump in his throat, as if those words had touched something deeply buried within him. He looked at the documents on the table, the evidence he had believed to be irrefutable, and began to question whether they really were. What if all of this is a mistake?" asked Marco, his voice almost a whisper. The Pope smiled, as if he already knew Marco would come to that conclusion. "Then we will have to find the truth together. But remember, the truth is not always easy to accept. It requires courage." Marco took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew the next step he took could change everything. Meanwhile, outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The Vatican, normally a symbol of peace and stability, was now the epicenter of a crisis no one could have foreseen. And at the heart of that crisis, two men from completely different worlds were discovering that they might have more in common than they had imagined. Marco Rossi left the audience hall with his mind swirling with thoughts. The words of Pope Francis echoed in his head, challenging everything he believed about justice, duty, and truth. He had entered the Vatican as an officer determined to follow orders, but now he found himself at a moral crossroads. As he walked through the silent corridors, Marco decided he needed answers. He couldn't simply move forward without knowing if he was doing the right thing. With a resolute look, he took out his phone and called a trusted colleague at Interpol. "Giovanni, I need a favor," said Marco, keeping his voice low. "Can you double-check the evidence against the Pope? Something's not right." On the other end of the line, Giovanni hesitated. "Marco, you know this could cost you your job, right? These orders came from the top." "I know," replied Marco firmly. "But if there's a chance this is a mistake, I need to find out. Please, Giovanni." There was a pause, and then Giovanni agreed. "All right, I'll take a look, but be careful, Marco. There's something bigger going on here." Marco hung up the phone and looked at the clock. He knew time was running out. The media was already in a frenzy, and the pressure on the Vatican was only increasing. He needed to act fast. Meanwhile, Pope Francis remained in the audience hall, surrounded by anxious cardinals. "Your Holiness, we need to make a public statement," insisted one of the cardinals. "The world is waiting for a response." The Pope looked at them calmly, but there was a determination in his eyes that silenced the room. "We need to act with wisdom, not haste. The truth will come to light, but we must ensure it is done the right way." The cardinals exchanged uncertain glances, but no one dared to contradict the Pope. They knew he had a vision that often went beyond what they could comprehend. Hours later, Marco received a call from Giovanni. His colleague's voice sounded tense. "Marco, you were right. There's something wrong here. The evidence was manipulated. The signatures, the transactions. It was all forged. Someone set this up to frame the Pope." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. He knew suspecting was one thing, but having confirmation was something entirely different. "Who did this, Giovanni? Who's behind it?" "I'm not entirely sure," replied Giovanni. "But there are indications that this comes from within Interpol itself, someone with a lot of power and influence." Marco took a deep breath, trying to process the information. He knew he was in danger. If someone within Interpol was involved, he couldn't trust anyone. "Thank you, Giovanni. You've saved more than you know," said Marco before hanging up. With a new sense of purpose, Marco returned to the audience hall. The Pope was still there, now sitting in a chair with his eyes closed in prayer. Marco hesitated for a moment, but then approached. "Your Holiness, I need to speak with you," said Marco, his voice filled with urgency. The Pope opened his eyes and looked at Marco with serenity. "What have you discovered, my son?" Marco handed over the new documents Giovanni had sent. "The evidence was forged. Someone within Interpol is behind this. They want to frame you for reasons we don't yet understand." The Pope examined the documents, but his expression remained calm. "So the truth is beginning to emerge. What do you intend to do now, Marco?" Marco looked at the Pope, and for the first time he felt he was on the right side. "I'm going to expose this. I can't let this continue, but I need your help." The Pope nodded as if he already knew what Marco was going to ask. "You have my blessing and my support. But remember, the truth can be dangerous. Are you willing to face the consequences?" Marco took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. "I am. I can't follow orders blindly anymore. I need to do what's right." The Pope smiled, a gesture that conveyed both pride and compassion. "Then let us begin. But first, we need to ensure your safety. There are people here in the Vatican who can help you." As the Pope and Marco discussed the next steps outside, the situation continued to deteriorate. The crowd at the Vatican gates now included protesters, both for and against the Pope. Local police tried to maintain order, but the tension was palpable. On social media, conspiracy theories multiplied. Some believed the Pope was the victim of a political plot, while others insisted he was guilty. The polarization was evident, and the world seemed on the brink of collapse. Inside the Vatican, Marco and the Pope worked together to unravel the conspiracy. They knew time was running out, but they also knew the truth was their greatest weapon. Night fell over the Vatican, and the tension only grew. The crowd at the gates was now an impatient mass, with voices blending into a chorus of outrage, curiosity, and fear. Inside the sacred walls, however, Pope Francis and Marco Rossi worked in silence, united by a common purpose: to reveal the truth. Marco had spent the last hours reviewing the forged documents and cross-referencing information with the help of a small group of cardinals trusted by the Pope. They discovered that the conspiracy was larger than they had imagined. There were indications that powerful figures within Interpol and foreign governments were involved, all with the goal of discrediting the Pope and undermining the Vatican's influence. "We need to act fast," said Marco, looking at the Pope. "If they find out we're investigating, they might try to silence us." The Pope nodded, but his expression was one of calm resolve. "The truth cannot be silenced, my son, but I agree we need to be strategic. What do you suggest?" Marco thought for a moment, and then an idea came to him. "We need a public statement, something that shows the world you have nothing to hide. If we can win the people's trust, it will be harder for them to continue this farce." The Pope looked at Marco, and a faint smile appeared on his face. "You're learning to think like a leader, Marco. But don't forget that the truth must be accompanied by compassion. Let's do this together." A few hours later, Pope Francis appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, facing a crowd eagerly awaiting a response. Cameras from around the world were focused on him, and the silence that followed was almost palpable. "Dear brothers and sisters," began the Pope, his voice calm but filled with authority, "today I have been accused of crimes I did not commit, and though these accusations are grave, I choose not to respond with anger or fear, but with love and truth." The crowd murmured, surprised by the Pope's frankness. Marco, watching closely, felt a chill. He knew the next moment would be crucial. "I forgive those who tried to frame me," continued the Pope, "because I believe true justice is not achieved through punishment, but through understanding and dialogue. And that is why I invite all of you to look beyond appearances and seek the truth in your hearts." The Pope's statement was like a wave spreading through the crowd. Some were moved, others confused, but all were touched by the sincerity of his words. Meanwhile, Marco acted behind the scenes. With the help of Giovanni and other allies, he accessed confidential information that proved the conspiracy. He knew he needed to act quickly before those involved could destroy the evidence. "It's done," Marco told the Pope just after the speech. "I have everything we need to expose the truth, but this will come at a cost. They won't like being exposed." The Pope placed his hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture of support. "You're doing the right thing, my son, and no matter what happens, know that you have my gratitude and my blessing." Marco felt a lump in his throat, but also a determination he had never felt before. He knew the next step would be the hardest, but also the most important. With the evidence in hand, Marco and the Pope organized a last-minute press conference. Journalists from around the world crowded into the Vatican, eager for more information. "Today we will reveal the truth," said Marco, facing the cameras. "And that truth is that Pope Francis was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy by people who want to undermine peace and justice. Here is the proof." As Marco presented the documents and recordings, the world watched in silence. The conspiracy was exposed in detail, and the names of those involved were revealed. The reaction was immediate: shock, outrage, and finally, a wave of support for the Pope. At the end of the press conference, Pope Francis stepped up to the microphone once more. I thank Marco Rossi for his courage and integrity. He has shown us that the truth always prevails, even in the darkest times. And now I invite all of you to join in prayer for those who have lost their way in the path of lies. May they find the light of truth and redemption. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marco felt a sense of relief and fulfillment. He had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. The press conference at the Vatican was like an earthquake that shook the world. The evidence presented by Marco Rossi and Pope Francis was irrefutable. Documents, recordings, and testimonies exposing an elaborate conspiracy to frame the Pope. The names of those involved, including high-ranking Interpol officials and influential political figures, were revealed publicly, causing an international scandal. In the hours that followed, newspaper headlines and social media trends were dominated by the story. Pope Francis innocent, conspiracy exposed, Marco Rossi, the cop, who defied the system, justice and mercy triumph at the Vatican. The world was in shock, but there was also a sense of relief and hope. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. The cardinals, who had been divided and anxious, now gathered to thank God for the resolution of the case. Marco Rossi, however, knew his fight was not over. "What will you do now?" asked the Pope, finding Marco in one of the Vatican gardens. The officer was sitting on a bench, looking up at the starry sky, as if trying to find answers in the stars. Marco sighed, feeling the weight of the last few hours. "I don't know, Your Holiness. I expose the truth, but that won't be enough to change the system. There are powerful people involved, and they won't accept defeat easily." The Pope sat beside Marco, his calming presence like a balm. "The truth is like a seed, my son. It may take time to grow, but once planted, it cannot be uprooted. You've done your part. Now let justice take its course." Marco looked at the Pope, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you really believe that things can change?" The Pope smiled, a gesture that conveyed ancient wisdom. "I believe in the power of good people like you who are willing to fight for what's right, and I believe that in the end, good always prevails." As they spoke, a messenger approached, handing an envelope to the Pope. He opened it and read the contents, his expression remaining calm but serious. "It's from the Attorney General," the Pope explained. "They're launching a formal investigation into those involved in the conspiracy. Your courage was not in vain, Marco." Marco felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the fight for justice would be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. "Thank you, Your Holiness," said Marco, his voice filled with emotion, "for showing me that there is hope, even in the darkest times." The Pope placed his hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture of blessing. "You don't have to thank me, my son. The truth is a gift given to us by God, and you used it with wisdom and courage." As the Pope rose to return to his duties, Marco stayed in the garden, reflecting on all that had happened. He knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew he had found a new purpose. Outside the Vatican, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact of that night would resonate for a long time. The world had witnessed not only the exposure of a conspiracy, but also the power of truth, compassion, and courage. The Vatican awoke the next morning with a sense of renewal. The sun shone over the gardens and fountains, as if nature itself were celebrating the victory of truth. Inside the sacred walls, Pope Francis prepared for another day of work, but this time with a peaceful smile on his face. In the private chapel, he knelt for a final prayer before facing the demands of the day. "Lord, thank you for guiding us through the darkness. Thank you for showing us that truth and love always triumph. Bless those who fight for justice and enlighten the hearts of those who have lost their way in the path of lies." As the Pope prayed, Marco Rossi walked through the Vatican corridors, reflecting on what he had experienced. He knew his life would never be the same. The experience had transformed him, showing him that justice wasn't just about following rules, but about doing what was right, even when it meant challenging the system. "Marco," called the Pope, finding him in the corridor, "have you decided what you'll do next?" Marco looked at the Pope, and for the first time, he felt he had a clear answer. "Yes, Your Holiness. I'm going to leave the police. I want to dedicate my life to helping others, perhaps working with at-risk youth or supporting social causes. I've learned that true justice begins with compassion." The Pope smiled, a gesture that conveyed pride and gratitude. "You've found your mission, my son, and I couldn't be happier for you. The world needs people like you, willing to fight for good no matter the cost." Marco felt a tear roll down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. It was a tear of relief, of fulfillment, of hope. "Thank you, Your Holiness, for everything." The Pope embraced Marco, a gesture that symbolized not only gratitude, but also the passing of a torch. "God bless you, Marco, and remember you will never be alone." As Marco left the Vatican, the Pope turned to the window, gazing at the horizon. He knew the world would still face many challenges, but he also knew there was hope. Truth and love would always find a way. And so, the story of Pope Francis and the police officer Marco Rossi came to an end, but their legacy would echo for generations. It was a lesson about courage, compassion, and the power of truth. And above all, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light always prevails. If you enjoyed this thrilling and twist-filled story, don't forget to like this video. Every like helps bring this narrative to more people. Leave a comment. And do, telling us what surprised you most about this story, or what your favorite moment was. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming fictional stories we're preparing. See you in the next video.